Carol Ann Duffy's A War Photographer was published in her collection A Standing Female Nude in 1985. Standing Female Nude deals with the outcasts of societies, as well as a host of women's issues. For example, my favorite poem in A Standing Female Nude has got to be Warming Her Pearls, which dealt with a maid who was secretly in love with her lady, which was, of course, uncommon. War Photographer, on the other hand, takes a much more bleak outlook on life. It deals with war photographers and the story of one war photographer and the cyclic nature of their job. See, war photographers, in this case World War II war photographers, had to go to the front lines in devastated cities and capture what they were seeing. But they could not intervene. They could simply observe what they were seeing. And that was it. They had to bring it back, and they had to let the editors and the magazines publish the pictures, which they managed to sell to them. So the best I could do was my TV. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to run through the poem with everyone, and we're also going to analyze the poem a bit, just to hammer in a few ideas, which will then be used to make connections with other works inside of the grade 12 English course. Here's the first stanza of War Photographer. As you can see, it's very regular. Duffy's poetry tends to have very traditional structure. So it has an A, B, B, C, D, D rhyme scheme, and this is present in the first, second, and third stanza, with the fourth stanza having no rhyming except for a rhyming couplet in the last two verses. So the first sentence is, "In his dark room he is finally alone." So this suggests a contrast between what, once you've read the whole poem, you can tell is the war zone. He is a war photographer. The dark room is a very calm place in contrast to the war zone. With the spools of suffering set out on ordered roads. So the spools of suffering set out, and the regular structure in general, which is present throughout the whole poem, suggests that his life is very structured in that it's a cycle, really. So he will go to a war zone, he will document it, experience these horrific events, and then he will come out, he will carry out the ceremonious process of developing film, trying to sell it, having the editors only pick out a few of them, and then having those published, and having to go back to a war zone. His life in that sense is very structured, and that's it's also imposed by the sibilants in the second line. The only light is red and softly glows. So the fact that the red light is softly glowing, you will observe that red is a common theme inside this poem, and the red is it represents the war zone, but dark rooms are also red, but they softly glow because a war zone would have artillery, bombs, fire, which are red, fiery, but unlike those, this is a different type of red. This is a softer red. As though this were a church and he, a priest preparing an intone mass. So this is an extended simile where he compares the process of developing the film as a priest preparing the mass. So this again imposes the structure, imposes the regularity, but later on in the last line of the stanza, Belfast, Beirut, Phnom Penh, all flesh is grass. As you can see, there's a lot of caesura in these lines. The caesura helps isolate these locations. It alters the rhythm of the reader. The reader has to pause and reflect about these locations because these locations are all war zones. Currently, the photographer is in rural England, so these are very isolated. The reader has to reflect on that, and then after that reflection, there is all flesh is grass. All flesh is grass is actually an allusion from the Holy Bible in the Old Testament in Isaiah 4:6, and that essentially just means that people die. That's just the nature of humanity. Here's the second stanza of the poem. So it starts off with caesura again. He has a job to do. It's certain this is his job that he has to do. This is his life. This cycle will continue. Solutions slop on trays beneath his hands, which do not tremble then, as though they seem now. Period. Now that period is significant because it's followed by rural England. Period again. That caesura again isolates that environment. So rural England is really different from the previous locations of Belfast, Beirut, which are being bombed. by bombers. Home again, to ordinary pain which simple weather can dispel, to fields which do not explode beneath their feet, of running children in a nightmare heat. So, the trembling hands is a reference to shell shock. So even though the war photographer is not a soldier, he was inside the war zone and he experienced pretty much the full extent of World War One. He was likely in cities like Belfast, which were being bombed by the Nazis, and he was also likely in the front lines to some extent. So he might have seen the artillery fire. So his hands are also trembling because he was in such a chaotic situation, and now he's in a very calm um, room with a glowing red light. It's a very ceremonious process, so it's hard to process the emotion. He continues on by comparing rural England to the war zones. A very interesting one is when he talks about the feet, about the ground not exploding beneath the children's feet. Um, in a nightmare's heat, so the nightmare's heat is likely bombing, so there might have been children running away from bombs in the war zone, or there might have been a minefield, and this just serves to show how isolated rural England is from the reality of the war, which is an important theme in the ending of the poem. So this is the third stanza of the poem. Something is happening, followed by a period. So this is Shazura again. The audience is being brought back from the image of explosions at the children's feet back to the environment which the setting which the war photographer is currently in, where he is developing film. So a stranger's features faintly start to twist before my eyes, a half-formed ghost, followed by a period. So Shazura again. So the stranger's features start to twist before my eyes. That's actually an allegory. So on a literal level, that is the actual film slowly starting to develop. So he is able to make out the figures on the photo paper now. But in a more literary level of understanding, this could perhaps represent the moral ambiguity of the situation, of being a war photographer in a situation where you take a picture and you're only supposed to be an observer. You can't get directly involved in the situation. A half-formed ghost. So again, literal level, there's an image starting to fade into the photo paper, but on a literary level, the half-formed ghost is most likely someone who's already died, or someone who he doesn't know the fate of. There's a sense of ambiguity again. He remembers the cries of the man's wife, how he sought approval without words to do what he must, and how the blood stained into the foreign dust. So this suggests that the man has done something perhaps heroic, where he sacrificed his own life as the blood stained into the foreign dust. Perhaps the man was a refugee of some sort who had to perhaps remove an explosive or something of that sort to save his family, perhaps his wife or someone else. So again, there's a sense of of moral ambiguity, because his wife was pleading for the man to not do it, but the man did it anyways, and there is a suggestion that it was a heroic action. Again, it also contrasts with the setting of rural England, where here we have a nice area where the worst thing that could ever happen is bad weather, and here where a man must make a decision between what he feels is right and what his wife is pleading him to do. So now we have reached the last stanza of the poem. 100 agonies in black or white, from which the editor will pick 5 or 6 for the Sunday supplement. So what really stands out here is the black and white. So black and white is of course reference to the camera which the photographer is using, which is likely a black and white camera. But it's also reference to the moral dilemma which the photographer is in. There's hundreds of agonies. Does he have the right to be taking pictures of those agonies? Is it a moral job? He does not know. And there's hundreds of agonies contrasted with 5 or 6 photographs selected. Is that moral? the fact that there are hundreds of agonies in front of the editor, and he only picks 5 or 6 which best suit his purpose, the editor's purpose. The reader's eyeballs prick with tears between the bath and pre-lunch beers. So again, this is rural England. Rural England is a very idyllic place and has stayed that way throughout World War II. There weren't bombs being thrown over rural England. It was a very nice place, very removed from the war. You were still having baths and pre-lunch beers, unlike a place such as Belfast or somewhere in Germany, which was being constantly bombed, and life was completely changed. The readers cannot fully appreciate the extent of the war, which is perhaps why the editors will only pick 5 or 6. Perhaps they're trying to create an image of what the war is, which is likely a romanticized one, which the government wants to have the people of Britain believe. From the aeroplane, he stares impassively at where he earns a living, and they do not care. So here we see that rhyming couplet again, and what that rhyming couplet really does is it helps finish the cyclic nature of the poem. You could have the poem start all over after that, and it would just be he went to the war zones again, he took more photographs, and the editor selected 5 or 6 of them for the Sunday supplement. This is really a job for him, and he's not to get into the conflict. He's only supposed to observe, and he is never to break the regularity of the cycle, which was reinforced through the regular structure of the actual poem. In the grade 12 English course, there were 2 works which had a lot of similarities with War Photographer by Carroll and Duffy. The first was Men in Black. In Men in Black, there were varying animation techniques used to convey certain emotions and concepts. For example, the foreground, middle ground, and background of each scene was animated independently so they could be shifted, and the shifts could represent a chaotic feeling inside the narrator. Another example was that there were 2 main monochromatic schemes used. There was a red fiery one, and there was a blue calm one, and those conveyed either chaotic and calm moods in the narrators throughout the narrator's day. Similarly, in Carroll Ann Duffy's poem, she used structural techniques such as caesura to draw emphasis to certain concepts and to perpetrate certain themes throughout the work. And I would argue that in Men in Black, the different emotions helped convey different themes in the work. For example, if a certain scene was chaotic and then the next where it was immediately blue, so calm and relaxed, then that could perhaps convey how war is not necessarily a constant stress, but it's a really on and off thing which can have an overall negative impact on a soldier. That's just one example. The second work, which had a lot of similarities with War Photographer by Anne Duffy, was a graphic novel series, Charlie's War. Now in Charlie's War, there's a romanticized image of war, and that is exposed and that is broken down. So in War Photographer, the photographer brings back hundreds of pictures, because it says hundreds of agonies, back to the editors, and the editors only pick 5 or 6 of them. So this suggests that the editor wants to create a certain image. Why wouldn't the editor pick a lot of the images and just use them throughout the year? No, the editor wants to create certain images of what the war is. For example, the editor may choose not to show the bombed German cities if the photographer had those, because it wants to show that the British forces are a just force and the Germans are evil. That's just an example, a hypothetical, but that would be the sort of image that an editor would want to convey to their readers. So a romanticized image to some extent is created. For example, the editor might also want to show bombarded Allied cities so that the rural Englanders would be more compelled to support the war effort and perhaps compelled to accept the rations more. In Charlie's War, Charlie heads to the front lines of France, and initially Charlie thinks that the war is great. And in the little letters that are that are present throughout the graphic novel series. One of the letters says, "Oh, the Western Front isn't that bad." Well, Charlie hasn't actually entered the Western Front. Charlie is just traveling towards it. And then after, when Charlie sees the rat infestations, the effect of shelling, and the fact that, corpses are sometimes just left to rot and then they bury and become skeletons, Charlie is confronted with the fact that the war isn't so great. The romanticized image of the war is broken. Another way that the romanticized image of the war is broken is when Charlie asks, "Sergeant, should we hate the Germans?" And the sergeant replies, "No, don't hate them. They're just scums." So propaganda back in England might have told Charlie that the Britons were this evil force and that we needed to fight against it. In fact, I remember learning in history class that that was in fact the case, and that there was often depictions of the Kaiser Wilhelm as a brute or an ape. So this is another romanticized image which was broken down. Another one was towards the very end, when Charlie realizes that the Somme offensive will be a complete failure, but he can't tell his generals. He realizes that maybe they're not in the best shape to fight this war as an army. So those were just a couple of parallels which I found were strong connections between the grade 12 English works studied in the grade 12 English course and the poem War Photographer by Carol Ann Duffy.